Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a topic that a lot of you have been asking about, generalized anxiety disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder.
GAD and OCD.
Exactly, GAD and OCD. We got a really great university-level psychology text from one of our listeners called Unit2.pdf.
Oh yeah, this one's dense.
Yeah, it's packed with info, and we're going to break it all down for you. But first, we always like to start with a little bit of a teaser, something to get you thinking. Did you know that worrying can actually be good for you sometimes?
Really?
Yeah, there are some upsides to worrying. We'll get into all of that and a whole lot more, so stay tuned.
Awesome. I'm excited to dive into this one. It's not about just labeling these things. It's about understanding them.
Totally. So let's start with GAD. Now, everyone experiences anxiety, right? You've got those deadlines looming at work, maybe a family dinner that you're dreading, waiting for those test results. We've all been there. But GAD, it's a whole different ballgame. It's like that anxiety dial is turned way up, and it just never really shuts off.
Think of it this way, right? Doctors have their big book for diagnosing all sorts of illnesses, the DSM. Well, mental health professionals, we have ours. And when it comes to GAD, what it really describes is this kind of persistent and excessive anxiety and worry that's really hard to control.
And it's not just like feeling stressed or nervous. We're talking about a whole cluster of symptoms here. You're on edge all the time. Your mind is racing. Your muscles are tense. You're exhausted, but you can't sleep. The DSM actually lists 6 key symptoms, and to be diagnosed with GAD, you typically need to experience at least 3 of those.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about GD is that it's often called free-floating anxiety. Sometimes you can pinpoint exactly what's making you anxious, right? Like you're about to give a presentation or you've got that dentist appointment that you've been putting off. But with GAD, the worry doesn't really attach itself to one specific thing. It's kind of like constantly searching for something to latch onto, bouncing from one worry to the next.
And it can be really, really debilitating. The text actually includes this case study about a woman named Fatima. She's been struggling with anxiety since childhood. Back then, it was, exams, what her friends thought of her, whether her dad would come home late from work. Now it's her husband's business, her pregnancy, her kids. It's like this constant snowballing of worries. It's exhausting. It's impacting her relationships. It's affecting her whole life.
Fatima's story it's really powerful, and unfortunately, it's not unique. GAD is more common than people might think, affecting about 3 to 5% of the population. And we see it more often in women than men. It also tends to go hand in hand with other mental health conditions, like depression.
That's a really important point. Okay, so we've talked about what GAD looks like, but what's actually going on that's causing it. The text goes into 2 main categories here, genetics and what's happening in the brain, like at a chemical level.
Right. So first with the genes, research actually shows a pretty strong connection between GAD and major depressive disorder. So that suggests they might share some genetic roots.
So it's like inheriting a predisposition to both conditions.
Exactly. Exactly.
Fascinating. Okay, and then when it comes to the brain, the text talks about this neurotransmitter called GABA, which basically acts like a calming agent in the brain, right? It helps regulate anxiety. But it seems like people with GAD often have lower levels of GABA, which could explain why they're kind of stuck in that constant worry mode.
It's like their brain's natural braking system for anxiety isn't working quite as well. And then there's cortisol, the infamous stress hormone.
Oh, yeah.
That plays a role too, along with something called CRH, which is what triggers the release of cortisol.
Okay, so it's all connected. It's like a chain reaction.
Yeah, it's complex, but super interesting.
It is. Our brains are wild. But it's not just biology, right? We can't forget about the psychological factors that contribute to GAD. The text dives into 2 main schools of thought here, the psychoanalytic approach and the cognitive behavioral approach.
Yeah, the psychoanalytic view, that's all about what's going on beneath the surface in our unconscious. Maybe there's some unresolved conflicts, often stemming from desires that we've repressed.
So like urges that society might deem unacceptable.
Exactly. So there's this constant tension between what we want and what we feel like we should want.
And that creates anxiety that might not even be conscious, but it manifests as GAD. Okay, I'm following. Now, the cognitive behavioral approach, that focuses more on our thoughts and behaviors, right? And how they contribute to anxiety.
Right. A big part of it is this concept of sense of mastery. The text argues that people with GAD often have a history of experiencing negative events that felt totally out of their control.
So like they develop this deep-seated sense of helplessness, which just fuels the anxiety fire.
Exactly. And it becomes this vicious cycle. Uncontrollable events lead to anxiety, And then the anxiety makes it even harder to feel in control. And then there's the role of early childhood experiences. The text talks about safety signals.
Safety signals. Interesting. What are those?
So imagine a child who's growing up in an environment where they consistently get reassurance, support and protection when they're scared or feel threatened. Those experiences are like safety signals. They teach the child that the world is generally a safe place and that they have the resources to cope when things get tough.
Gotcha. So if a child doesn't get enough of those safety signals, they might grow up feeling more vulnerable, like the world is a dangerous place, which can lead to anxiety later in life.
That's the idea. It's amazing how those early experiences can shape our mental well-being in such a big way. But, and here's where things get really interesting, the text actually says that worrying can serve some positive functions.
Wait, hold on. Positive. You're telling me there's a good side to worrying.
Well, think of it this way, like worrying is your brain running fire drills. It helps you anticipate problems, right?
Yeah.
Mentally prepare for different outcomes, maybe even avoid potential catastrophes.
So in a way, it's a form of problem solving.
Right. A little bit of worry can be adaptive, but when it becomes excessive, uncontrollable, like in GAD, that's when it backfires.
Yeah.
That's when it starts to rob you of joy and you become more vulnerable to intrusive thoughts.
And there's that whole cognitive bias thing too, right? The text mentions how people with GAD are more likely to spot threats, even when they're not really there, and they tend to hold on to negative images for longer.
Yeah, it's like their internal radar is constantly on high alert, scanning for danger, which of course feeds the anxiety loop.
It makes a lot of sense. Wow, okay, so GAD is much more complicated than most people realize. I'm starting to see that. But let's shift gears now and talk about OCD. We throw around the word obsessed all the time, but clinically speaking, it's a whole different animal.
Totally different. When we talk about OCD, we're not talking about, being really into a new song or a TV show. We're talking about these intrusive, unwanted thoughts, images, or even impulses that trigger really intense anxiety. Even when the person knows, logically, that these thoughts are irrational, they still cause a lot of distress. It's like having a broken record player stuck on repeat in your head, playing the same disturbing track over and over.
And the content of these obsessions can be really disturbing, like fears of contamination, harming loved ones, religious obsessions, needing things to be perfectly symmetrical or in a very specific order.
And these thoughts lead to the second part of OCD, which is the compulsions.
Right, the compulsions. These are the repetitive behaviors or sometimes even mental acts that people with OCD feel driven to perform to try to neutralize or reduce the anxiety from the obsessions.
It's like their mind is trying to make a bargain.
Yeah.
If I do this ritual, then that terrible thing that I'm afraid of won't happen.
So the text gives some examples of these compulsions, like excessive cleaning, checking things repeatedly, counting, repeating words or phrases, hoarding, arranging things in a specific way.
Right, and these compulsions, they're not enjoyable. They can be very time-consuming and disruptive. They can take over a person's life.
Yeah. The text talks about a young professional named Raj. His story is a great example of how debilitating OCD can be. He has this intense fear of contamination, and he spends hours every day meticulously washing himself, following all these strict rules. It's impacting his work, his relationships. He can't even enjoy a meal with friends anymore without his rituals taking over.
It's heartbreaking, and Raj's case really illustrates just how pervasive OCD can be. It can seep into every area of your life, affecting your physical health, your relationships, your work, your ability to just, enjoy life. It's really important to understand that OCD can show up in different ways. Some people experience mostly obsessions, others mostly compulsions, and some have a combination of both.
It's interesting to think about the two layers of anxiety they must be experiencing, right? Not just the distress from the obsessive thoughts themselves, but then also the awareness that they're being compelled to do these rituals, even though they know they're irrational.
It's a constant battle.
So what's at the root of OCD? What causes this complex interplay of obsessions and compulsions?
It seems to be a mix of biological and psychological factors. The text points out that while the specific content of those obsessions and compulsions might vary across cultures, the core symptoms, they're pretty universal.
So that cross-cultural consistency, that kind of suggests a strong biological component, right?
Right. And the text dives into a few key areas: genetics, brain abnormalities, and the role of neurotransmitters. Starting with genetics, there's actually some interesting research that shows connections between OCD and other conditions that have a strong genetic basis, like Tourette syndrome, which is characterized by UDIX, and childhood autism.
So if you have a family history of those conditions, are you more likely to develop OCD?
It seems like there could be a shared genetic vulnerability. It doesn't mean that everyone with a family history of those conditions will develop OCD, but it does increase the likelihood.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about brain abnormalities? What's going on there?
So brain imaging studies have shown that people with OCD tend to have increased activity in certain brain regions, specifically the caudate nucleus, the orbital frontal cortex, and the cingulated cortex.
Those are some big words. What do those parts of the brain do exactly?
They're all involved in really important functions like emotion regulation, impulse control, decision-making, like the control center for managing our thoughts and actions. So the fact that these areas are overactive in people with OCD might explain why it's so hard for them to shut off those intrusive thoughts and resist those compulsive behaviors.
So it's like their brain is stuck in overdrive.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And then there's the role of neurotransmitters, those chemical messengers that carry signals between brain cells. The text focuses on serotonin, which is really important for regulating mood, anxiety, and obsessive thoughts.
Right, serotonin. So are you saying that people with OCD might have problems with their serotonin levels or how their brain is using serotonin?
Exactly. It all comes down to that delicate balance of brain chemicals.
Wow, so we've got genetics, brain structure, and neurochemicals all playing a part. It's like a perfect storm brewing in the brain.
Right.
Okay, but we also have to consider the psychological side of things. The text mentions three main theories here: psychoanalytic, learning, and cognitive. Let's start with psychoanalytic.
Yeah, so this theory, goes back to Freud and all that. It suggests that OCD might actually be rooted in a fixation in the anal phase of development, which is like between the ages of 18 months and 3 years old.
But hold on, are you saying that potty training gone wrong can lead to OCD?
Well, it's more nuanced than that. But the basic idea is that overly strict or harsh toilet training can create this conflict between a child's natural impulses and like what their parents are demanding of them. And this conflict could lead to a preoccupation with cleanliness, order, and control, which might manifest as OCD later on.
Huh, that's interesting. Okay, what about learning theories? How do those explain OCD?
Learning theories are all about how we develop fears and behaviors through our experiences. So remember Raj's fear of contamination. Let's imagine, as a kid, he touched something dirty and then maybe had a really negative experience afterward, like he got really sick. That initial pairing of the dirty object with the negative experience could create this conditioned fear response.
So even though touching something dirty doesn't inherently cause illness, his brain learned to associate the two, so he developed a phobia.
Exactly. And then the compulsions, the hand washing, that comes in as a way to try to reduce the anxiety caused by the fear.
But then every time he washes his hands, he gets this temporary relief, which reinforces the behavior, right?
Exactly. It's that negative reinforcement loop. The compulsions provide temporary relief, but they also strengthen that connection between the feared object and the anxiety. So the cycle just keeps going.
Makes sense. Okay, and last but not least, we have the cognitive theories.
Right. So cognitive theories really emphasize the role of negative automatic thoughts, perfectionism, and a really important concept called thought-action fusion.
Thought-action fusion. That sounds intense. What is that exactly?
It's basically the belief that simply thinking about something is as bad as doing it, or that thinking about something will make it more likely to happen.
So for someone with OCD, if they have an intrusive thought about, say, harming a loved one, that thought can feel as real and terrifying as if they actually did it.
Exactly. And that's what makes thought-action fusion so powerful. It fuels those catastrophic thinking patterns, making the obsession so much more distressing and making the compulsion seem absolutely necessary.
It's like their thoughts become a form of self-torture.
That's a really powerful way to put it.
Wow. Okay, so clearly OCD is way more complex than most people realize. But thankfully, as we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive, there is hope. And even though it might be difficult to completely eradicate OCD, treatment can help people manage their symptoms and get their lives back.
That's right. And we'll delve into the different treatment options in the next part of our deep dive.
That's right. And, even though a complete cure may not always be possible, treatment can really help people manage their symptoms and start living a more fulfilling life.
That's encouraging to hear.
Yeah.
So when we talk about treatment, what exactly are we talking about here? Is it medication? Is it therapy? Some combination of both? What does the text say?
Well, the text is pretty clear that medication alone, it's not usually the most effective long-term approach for GAD or OCD, especially OCD. And Psychoanalytic therapy, the approach we talked about that focuses on those unconscious conflicts, it also hasn't shown to be that effective for these conditions. What seems to work best, what the text really emphasizes, is a combination of medication and cognitive behavioral therapy.
CBT.
Exactly, CBT. So with CBT, we're talking about changing negative thought patterns and behaviors, right?
That's it. For a CBT might involve, challenging those catastrophic thinking patterns we talked about, those what-if scenarios that can spiral out of control, and helping people develop coping strategies for managing that worry.
Okay, so it's about giving people the tools to kind of interrupt those anxious thought loops and replace them with more balanced, more realistic thoughts.
Exactly.
And for OCD, I'm guessing CBT would focus on tackling those thought action fusion beliefs and breaking that cycle of compulsions.
You got it. And one specific type of CBT that has been really successful for OCD is exposure and response prevention, or ENRP.
Okay, ENRP. I've heard that term before, but honestly, I'm not entirely sure how it works. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So imagine someone with OCD who has a contamination fear, right?
Yeah.
And they feel compelled to wash their hands all the time, excessively. So in ENRP, they would be gradually exposed to the things that they fear, starting with something relatively mild, maybe like touching a doorknob. But here's the key. They would then be prevented from doing their usual compulsion, which is the hand washing.
So they have to sit with that anxiety and that uncertainty, but without their usual coping mechanism. That sounds really, really tough.
It can be very challenging, but it's also very effective.
Yeah.
What they learn through this process is that the anxiety that they're feeling, it will eventually subside on its own, even without doing the ritual.
Oh, okay.
This helps to break the association between the feared object or situation and the compulsion. It's like retraining the brain to realize, hey, that feared consequence, it's not actually going to happen, even if I don't do the ritual.
So it's almost like facing your fears head on and proving to yourself that you can handle it.
Exactly. It's about building up that sense of mastery and control that we talked about earlier, showing yourself that you are stronger than your OCD.
I like that. Okay, so we've talked about CBT and ENRP. What about medication? The text mentioned a couple of medications that are commonly used for OCD. What can you tell us about those?
Medications like clomipramine and fluoxetine, which are types of antidepressants, they've shown some success in reducing OCD symptoms. And they work by affecting serotonin levels in the brain, which we talked about as playing a role in regulating mood, anxiety, and those obsessive thoughts.
Right, so medication can help kind of take the edge off those symptoms, but it's not a cure.
That's right. And it's really important to remember that medication alone is not a cure. It's most effective when it's used in combination with therapy, like CBT.
So it's like the medication can help to quiet the noise of the symptoms enough for someone to really engage in the work of therapy and start to change those thought patterns and behaviors.
Exactly. It's a two-pronged approach,
Yeah,
tackling OCD from both a biological and a psychological angle.
makes sense. And ultimately, what the text seems to be emphasizing is that even though it might not be possible to completely eliminate all the symptoms, treatment can make a huge difference in someone's life, right? It can help them regain control and start living a more fulfilling life.
That's exactly right. There is hope, and nobody has to suffer in silence.
Okay, that's really good to hear. Wow, this deep dive has been incredibly informative. We've covered a lot, from the clinical definitions of GAD and OCD to the complex interplay of biological and psychological factors, and then we've touched on treatment approaches.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have. And I think the most important takeaway for our listeners is that there is help available, and it can really make a difference.
Couldn't agree more.
But before we wrap things up, is there one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with? Something to ponder as they continue to learn about GAD and OCD?
I keep thinking about that concept of thought-action fusion that we talked about earlier with OCD. That belief that just thinking about something is as bad as doing it, or that it makes it more likely to happen. I would like the listener to consider, how much do you believe that just thinking about something makes it more likely to happen? Because that question, that idea, is at the very heart of how we understand and treat OCD.
That's a really powerful question.
Right.
It makes you really stop and think about the power of our own thoughts. And if you found this deep dive helpful, we encourage you to keep exploring these topics.
Yeah, keep learning.
Knowledge is power, and understanding these conditions is the first step toward getting help and finding relief.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This has been an incredible deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic to explore. Until then, Take care and keep those brains buzzing.
Yeah, it really does, doesn't it? Like, how much do our thoughts actually shape our reality? It's a pretty deep question when you think about it.
It is, and it's something that folks with OCD, they deal with that question every single day.
That's so true. And that's why, I think having this understanding, this knowledge about these conditions is so crucial. It's like the first step toward, really breaking free from the grip of that anxiety and fear.
Absolutely. The more we understand about GAD and OCD, the better we're able to support ourselves and the people around us who might be struggling. That's a great point. And speaking of support, we've talked about the clinical definitions, the symptoms, the causes, the treatment options, but what about just like day-to-day living? What are some things that people with GAD or OCD or their loved ones, what can they do to kind of manage these conditions outside of a therapist's office? Does the text touch on that at all?
It does. It really emphasizes the importance of self-care. Like, it's essential. It's about building a strong foundation, and that includes things like making sure you're getting enough sleep, eating a healthy diet, exercising regularly, and practicing some relaxation techniques like mindfulness or deep breathing.
Those are all like great tips for anyone, really, not just for people with GED or OCD.
Exactly. These are fundamental things. They're the pillars of well-being for everyone. But for people who are struggling with GAD and OCD, these practices can be especially helpful in managing those symptoms.
What about support groups? Are those helpful at all?
The text doesn't specifically talk about support groups, but I think connecting with others who really understand what you're going through can be so powerful.
Yeah.
It can help you feel less alone, less isolated. There's something really validating about that. And there are a lot of great support groups out there, both online and in person, for both GAD and OCD.
It's like having that community, that sense of belonging where you can share your experiences and, your struggles and your successes without feeling judged.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a safe space to learn from each other, to offer support, and pick up some new coping strategies.
That's awesome. Well, this has been a really incredible deep dive. We've covered so much. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface, but it's been so informative.
Yeah, I agree. And I hope that our listeners feel empowered, to keep learning about these topics, to maybe seek out more information, and to reach out for help if they need it.
Yeah, for sure. You're not alone in this. There are resources out there, people who understand, and treatments that can really make a difference. So keep learning, keep asking those questions, and take care of yourselves.
And remember that question that I asked earlier about whether you believe that thinking about something makes it more likely to happen. Just keep that in mind, as you go about your day, as you notice those thoughts popping up. It's a good reminder that we have more power over our minds than we sometimes realize.
That's a great point. A great note to end on. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners, we'll be back soon with another episode and another fascinating topic to explore. Until then, take care and keep those brains buzzing.